Hi, this is Paul. There are a bunch of good pieces that were out on Substack this morning. It's the 5th of July. Yesterday was the 4th of July, and so I took the day off, like many Americans did, and this morning spent time catching up on email, etc., etc. Kel Zeldin had a really good Substack that I might engage at some point. A lot of this corner stuff in that Substack. Paul Kingsnorth had a big piece on Unheard. Kingsnorth, who I will be meeting with in Belfast at Benbury Priory with Mark Connolly. He's an interesting guy. That's a far deeper piece that I need more time to sort of absorb. Richard Beck, who doesn't get mentioned here, I read Richard Beck's blog a number of years ago. He has a really good piece on compassion fatigue and metaphysics, which I think fits really closely in with Vervaeke's project, but from a Christian, more of a Beck is difficult to sort of categorize. He's sort of mainline, but doesn't seem to be captured by them completely. But the piece that I wanted to talk about is Aaron Wren's Substack that came out this morning, and I noticed I looked for a YouTube where he read it, but he didn't have one. So I thought I'd read it and engage with it a little bit. Aaron Wren, of course, met up with him in Chicago with the Chicago meetup, and you can find my conversation with him and with Esther O'Reilly, Bethel McGrew. From there, I should probably go and look at it. I could repost it here, and maybe I'll do that when I'll be heading on vacation in about a week or so, and so you might not hear from me a lot for the 2 weeks after that. We'll see what happens. I know I've threatened that before, but during Synod, I know you didn't hear a lot from me, so this whole summer is going to be like that. Anyway, Aaron Wren. The title of it is Why Men Tune Into Online Gurus Instead of the Church. And even though he looks at this pretty much in terms of sort of manosphere type issues, it's true. It's true generally speaking, and has to do with the loss of cultural influence and authority of the church that has been going on in the United States for the last 100 years. Has certainly happened in Europe, and so this is a big deal. Why men tune into online gurus instead of the church. The Christian Manosphere blogger Deep Strength. Top things women don't want men to know about or just tell you. And he highlighted this video by, what's the guy's name? Casey Zander. I think he calls himself Uncle C in the video. I watched a little bit of the video. Christian Manosphere blogger Deep Strength pointed me to this video by someone named Casey Zander. He's a newer Manosphere-style dating and lifestyle coach. It's an interesting 20 minutes from about 7 months ago, and not especially from about 7 months ago, and not especially sexual. The preview image is the more sexual part. It's worth a watch to understand the appeal online gurus have in today's young men. The thing that prompted me to watch this video is the fact that Zander is standing in front of a whiteboard with about 25 different bullet points on it. I previously said that the Manosphere's red pill approach has two components, a model of intersexual dynamics and a library of techniques. I think that's right. Technique is sort of the hallmark of a lower register orientation, because it's about eliciting the desired outcomes. I was actually thinking on my walk today to work, the relationship between ritual and technique. See, this is how we go. I start out on one thing, and my ADHD self goes to different places, but I gotta go there because these were part of the dozens of thoughts I had today that said I want to make a video about this. This Rebel Wisdom video, reflecting on the pandemic with Zubin Damania, I thought was a really good video. I thought it was, especially from a Rebel Wisdom perspective, an excellent retrospective on the last 5 years or so. David Wilson is sort of wrapping up Rebel Wisdom. And so a retrospective conversation like this with a very friendly interlocutor, I thought very, very well done. And I might do some commenting on this video as such. One of the things that they mentioned in this video was the need for ritual. So one of the interesting things reading these histories, this history of the Pacific War, is the transformation that happened in the first period of the war to the second period of the war. What happens as the American military machine ramps up to produce the kinds of soldiers and sailors and ships and planes and armaments needed to fight the Japanese is, in fact, a total transformation of the war compared to what it had been before. I think that for anyone that participated in the war, there were actually 2 wars, said Roger Bond, a veteran quartermaster on the Saratoga. If you went out to the Pacific after, let's say, January 1944, you had a completely different experience and viewpoint than those before, because it really was 2 different operations. The carrier duels of 1942 had been tense fencing matches in which the fortunes of war had often turned on unexpected directions. You can see that if you watch some of the you can watch YouTube video, animations of the Battle of Midway, the 1976 movie Midway, the 2019 movie Midway. I think part of the reason there's sort of a romance about that is that it becomes this monumental battle that is sort of winner take all, and it hinges on things that it's enchanted in that it sort of hinges on things that nobody can sort of forecast. There's the intelligence breakthrough, there's the weather, there's the surprise. And so the carrier duels of 1942 had been tense fencing matches in which the fortunes of war had often turned in unexpected directions. Opposing task force commanders had played cat and mouse with weather fronts, always maneuvering to gain the most tactical favorable position with respect to the enemy. The impulse had always been to stay on the move, to get in and get out, to hit and run. In 1944, Task Force 58 could simply take position off an enemy-held island and batter its airfields into oblivion, brushing off the risk of counterstrikes. There's, in a sense, a meaning crisis built into this war, into this transition within the war. The immense size of the task force ensured its omnipotence in whatever part of the ocean it occupied. Hundreds of F-6Fs won and maintained complete air superiority throughout the daylight hours. Unlike the F-4 Wildcats, which were in some ways inferior to the Zeros and in other ways superior. They had better armor. They had a bigger, better engine. The Zeros were more light, maneuverable, could climb faster. Once the F-6Fs came on board, the Japanese couldn't develop a new fighter. They simply didn't have that kind of technological and industrial capacity to really go toe-to-toe with the United States, which is something that Yamamoto knew going into the war. Improved radar systems and increasingly efficient combat information centers provided ample warnings of incoming enemy planes. Screening ships carried more and better anti-aircraft weapons, and the introduction of the proximity fuse, which detonated the shell upon detecting the enemy's aircraft in proximity, rendered those weapons much more lethal. Destroyers steamed at the outer edge of the task group, employed better sonar systems that had refined their tactics against enemy submarines. The remarkable logistical capacities of the Service Squadron 10 permitted the carrier forces to remain at sea 6 to 8 weeks without putting into any port or anchorage, which in turn expanded their range and mobility. The big ships fueled at sea, took on ammunition at sea, and replenished provisions at sea. Replacement aircraft were ferried out to the Western Pacific on jeep carriers and flown aboard whenever they were needed. C.S. King, a chief yeoman on the Hornet, spent more than a year and a half on the ship without ever once setting foot on shore. He could have taken liberty at a recreation area and any number of atolls, but never felt the need. I spent an ungodly amount of time out there in the Pacific without ever leaving the ship. I didn't really notice it. I just felt at home at sea. I really did. I felt that's what the Navy's all about. So you see this development of, let's say, the machine, and obviously in war, oh yeah, it might be romantic to be, dueling with the Japanese. It wasn't romantic in the early parts of the war, where the Japanese are basically steamrolling everything in sight. You have the Bataan Death March. You have their conquest of pretty much anything in sight until the Battle of Midway, which becomes a turning point. But you just have this enormous machine, and it's a vast learning machine. This a little later in the book. As the American commanders took stock of what they had achieved at the Marshalls, their confidence and self-assurance rose to new heights. In less than 3 months, the costly lessons of Tarawa had been refined and integrated into amphibious planning and doctrine, and the results had been more than satisfactory. To the extent that further performance was needed, it was in the details of execution rather than any deficiencies of the plans themselves. Holland Smith concluded in his final report, in the attack of coral atolls, very few recommendations can be made to improve the basic techniques previously recommended and utilized in Flintlock. Nowhere in the Pacific had the pre-invasion bombardment and aerial bombings of the islands been more effective. General Smith estimated that 50 to 75% of the Japanese garrison on Roy Namur had been killed before the first Marines set foot on the island. Those who had survived the barrage were apparently dazed and patently less ferocious than their counterparts on Batio and other Pacific battlefields. Carrier aircraft in the 3 days before the landings managed to knock out nearly every Japanese airplane in the entire archipelago. Upon departing from the targets, pilots noted that ground installations were reduced to mounds of rubble. Hardly a tree was left standing, and those remaining were completely stripped of their foliage by the terrific bombardment. Most of the Marine and Army assault troops had never experienced combat before Flintlock and Catchpole, but their training had produced a first-rate performance. This is liturgy. This is training. And anyone who's ever been a part of the military, I've never been a part of the military, unlike many of you, but basically part of the reason that you drill and you train and you have all of these rituals is because basically the repetition means strength replaces intention, in that all of this is practiced, rehearsed, practice, rehearse. In a sense, it becomes a ritual machine that achieves the outcome desired by the entire organism, let's say. And the desire is learn to take over these little Pacific atolls, wipe out the Japanese in there, bring in the Seabees quickly, put in the airstrip, have our own base of operations by which we can continue to get closer and closer to Japan. That was how the Pacific War was fought. So most of the Marine and Army assault troops had never experienced combat before. In other words, they didn't work from sort of the idiosyncrasies of personal experience, but their training had produced a first-rate performance. The only lapse in discipline had been on Roy when several troops had charged ahead across the battlefield and surged ahead to the north shore. The lines had been reassembled before the enemy could attack the exposed flank. At any event, no ground commander could find much fault in troops who showed so much spirit on the attack. As in other operations, Japanese stragglers and infiltrators remained a threat behind the advancing lines, and the infantrymen were obliged to do the grim work of cleaning out the bunkers, tunnels, emplacements one by one with demolition charges, flamethrowers, and hand grenades. By 1944, however, not even the newcomers had any illusion about the enemy's way of waging war. In other words, there's a relationship here between recursion and ritual, and it's about finding the practices in order to achieve an outcome. So let's take a little peek at this video.
Uncle C, back in the office, and in today's video, this is going to be one of the deepest videos I have ever covered on this topic, and it is things a woman just will not tell you. Now, I'm making this video for 3 specific reasons. Okay, the very first reason that I'm giving this to you is because I watch guys in their 20s make the same mistakes in their 30s, and they make the same mistakes in their 40s, and they will consistently...
Okay, so this is about ritual. Mistakes. Well, what is a mistake? Mistake is getting an outcome that is undesired or unintended instead of the outcome you desire through the practices that you're pursuing.
I think that the women they enter into relationships with, that she's just a hard one to crack. Oh, I'm not lucky. I picked the wrong ones. No, that's not the truth. The fact is you don't understand women. So that's the first.
Now, clearly in this, there's a sense of meaning crisis in that we're going to demythologize women. And we're going to demythologize women, and we're going to establish for ourselves rituals and practices that will achieve the outcomes and ends we desire.
Saving you decades. The second reason why I'm making...
Saving you decades. You don't need your own personal experience of loss and disaster burning up the limited amount of time you have on Earth between 0 and 80, very much a secular frame. But if you learn my tricks, you will get what you want. And just looking at the board, you have her primal desires, why she tests you, what she's thinking about, command, arousing, so I'm not going to play the whole thing.
This video is after working with thousands of students over the past few years.
Students.
I bet you never would have guessed this would happen, but Uncle C's knowledge has grown over the years. And as it grows over the years, the fact is I can give back better, deeper, more in-depth content. And last but not least, I just like talking about the dating, the attraction, and the masculinity game. So without further ado,
I just like talking about it because it makes me feel successful. And okay, so there's a lot that goes on there. But you didn't come to this video to look for how to be a pickup artist or how to... Well, what are the goals? And I think Ren picks up on this quite well. As I previously said, that the Manosphere's red pill approach had two components: a model of intersexual dynamics and a library of techniques. This video is primarily in the former category. How does substantive and informative... Note how substantive and informative the video is. Xander's providing a breakdown similar to a consultant in a boardroom of some of the fundamentals of male-female dynamics. While he does not give a lot of specific tips, the information he provides has obvious practical applications. A big reason why young men are turning into these online gurus is that those gurus give them news they can use. It's also, by and large, much more accurate than what they hear from traditional authority figures. Regarding Jordan Peterson, I previously wrote how he simply gave men truer information than they were getting from Christian leaders. Superstar evangelical pastor Matt Chandler said, "I keep saying it, godliness is sexy to godly people." Jordan Peterson says, "Girls aren't attracted to boys who are their friends, even though they might like them, whatever that means. They are attracted to boys who win status contests with other boys." Who is telling the truth? Traditional authorities and institutions are in decline because they, A, haven't been delivering good results in too many domains, and B, because they are too often more interested in saying things that will earn the social approval of their aspirational peers than they are in speaking the truth. Now, there's a lot of complexity in that paragraph for Ren, and there's a lot of truth to it. And now these delivering the goods, that's outcomes. But of course, we're always dealing with evaluating the good. Oh, what did he say on Twitter today? So Zach Randolph at me on Twitter saying, "I was recently asked to define good. Here's what I came up with. Good is a pleasure time doesn't disprove." It's sort of knocking on the door of John Piper's Christian hedonism. Not definitive by any means, but hopefully useful. And I think, and my comment to him was say that time doesn't disapprove is very God number one-ish. It sort of works. And so this fella here is looking for, well, I'm going to show you how to get what you want from women. Well, what do you want from women? Well, probably some attention, probably some affection, probably some sex, probably some status, probably some companionship, maybe a good meal, but now time comes into that. And so when Matt Chandler says godliness is sexy to godly people, yeah. And Jordan Peterson mentions the contest with status hierarchies, yeah. But people are really complex. So, of course, in a Christian context, godliness has its own status hierarchy. And women are attracted to men who are in that status hierarchy. And this social approval of their aspirational peers, well, so if you're living in sort of a wokish environment, men who, and Joe Rogan pointed this out a long time ago, men who appear to really be emulating the values of that wokish environment will be attracted to women who are themselves convinced by the wokish environment. The same thing goes with Christian environments. So in other words, those two things aren't necessarily against each other. It's sort of a both and, because of course godliness is a hierarchy just like the status contests that Jordan Peterson is talking about. And good results, well, that's sort of, again, the dead reckoning. And I often use that term, I think about it as I'm going through these World War II Pacific war stories, because what is dead reckoning? Well, let's say you take off from an aircraft carrier and you want to get to a certain point on the map. You don't have GPS, and if you're flying low and there's clouds above and you can't navigate by the stars, you just use your compass heading and you look at your speed and you do your math, and when you get over a certain point, you say, well, that island should be below me here. Now, of course, the proof is in the pudding. Is the island below you? Do you fly into a mountain? Are you lost? I mean, dead reckoning is sort of making our way through, and there's a lot of good in that. Good is a pleasure time doesn't disprove. I think that's really quite a nice little phrase. So, who's telling the truth? Well, a lot of that depends on the good. And of course, good has a time frame in it. If you're a 20-something or a 30-something and you probably think you know what a woman is for, at least what a woman is for in your life, or what a man is for in your life. Well, I'll tell you, if you're married a long time, that's going to change. Well, why? Well, lots of things change about us as things go over time. And this is part of the reason behind sort of Jordan Peterson's sort of Darwinian approach to religion, which is that the longest, truest things get encoded into religious teachings, and they endure. And kind of my Brett Weinstein will he'll say, well, maybe they're technologically disrupted. And I think with respect to men and women, over the last 100 years, we've had a lot of technological disruption. But those two ideas sort of have opponent processing between them. And I was writing about marriage and same-sex marriage. I mean, that debate on CRC Voices is just endemic right now. It's just ongoing. Well, we're sort of trying to deal with the good. And so, what God says in sort of a God number one-ish way is sort of, well, what continues to work and what doesn't work. But of course, you've got Christianity, which takes that sort of karmic approach to God that you can often find in the Old Testament and other places. And again, because Jesus is so countercultural, and so Job begins the critique of karma, and Jesus really upends it with his resurrection, because Jesus does all the wrong things and then is resurrected and is pronounced in Philippians 2 the ruler over heaven and earth. He ascends into heaven. And that's basically how Christianity sort of critiques and engages karma. But we're always just trying to figure out this good, figure out what's true. And, well, people, generally speaking, in a dead reckoning way, want a happy life. Happy is sort of a very simple, very local dead reckoning posture. So traditional authorities and institutions are in decline because they haven't been delivering good results in too many domains. And that's on sort of both sides of it. If high status, rock star Christian leaders can't themselves live out the Christian sexual life, it casts doubt whether that's Ravi Zacharias, or whether that's high-profile Roman Catholic priests, that sort of casts doubt on the formula as to whether or not it delivers the goods. Now, of course, Christianity comes back and says, no, this is a cruciform life, and we're heading towards the life of the age to come. But Christianity, in many ways, is a very subtle, integrated religion, and that it's always trying to sort of have it both ways. You have the now and the not yet in terms of eschatology. And even some of the sayings of Jesus talks about that. Jesus started on his way. A man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, what on earth do we mean by eternal life? That's life of the age to come. Well, that's the best kind of life. That's a life that doesn't decay. That's a life that stands the test of time. That's the best kind of life. But there's a tension between now and then. Why do you call me good? Jesus answered. No one is good except God alone. You know the commandments. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony. You shall not defraud. Honor your father and mother. Those are basic, fairly karmic approaches to obedience that can lead to great things. Teacher, he declared, all these I have kept since I was a boy. Jesus looked at him and loved him. One thing you lack, he said. Go sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. Now, having a lot of money is a really handy thing in this world. It's comfortable, it's good, it's nice. Get into the King's North Substack, or the King's North Unheard piece about capitalism. That one will really be interesting in this little corner of the internet. At this, the man's face fell. He went away sad because he had great wealth. So right there, he's sort of caught between a life of denial, a life of relinquishing the pleasures of this world, with a life that is, well, obviously feels good right here and right now. Jesus looked around and said to his disciples, how hard is it for the rich to enter the kingdom of God? The disciples were amazed at his words. And again, we should, and honestly, probably be a little bit more amazed at them too. Because, and part of the reason they're amazed is that wealth in the older karmic instantiation was an expression of God's favor. You see it in the patriarchs. When the patriarchs flourish, when King David flourishes, if someone is flourishing, well, they're receiving the blessings of God or the gods. That was basically the old conceptualization of puzzling out the universe. If things are going well, you must be doing something right. If you're beating the Japanese regularly now in the atolls, you must be doing something right. God is blessing your troops. God is blessing your nation. This is basically the oldest way to sort of figure out and level up to figuring out, well, what is the will of God? Well, the will of God is that which brings blessing. It's very God number one-ish. Jesus said to them, children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. The disciples were even more amazed and said to each other, who then can be saved? Jesus looked at them and said, with man this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. Then Peter spoke up. We have left everything to follow you. Peter, not so often running in as Captain Obvious. Truly I tell you, Jesus replied, no one who has left home or brother or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for me and the gospel will fail to receive 100 times as much in this present age, homes, brothers, sisters, mothers, children, and fields, along with persecutions, and in the age to come eternal life. But many of you who are first will be last, and the last first. So what does he say? So on one hand, he says, he sort of completely guts sort of the old karmic approach that Job's friends embraced. And he turns it around and says, no, if you give your life to your gospel, you'll certainly receive more in this life and persecutions and also in the age to come. So in that way, Christianity is very much a both and religion. And it deals with these tensions in that way. There's nothing unique, back to Aaron Wren's piece. There's nothing unique to Xander's advice as far as I saw from a brief perusal on his website and YouTube. He tells men to become high value in multiple domains of life, fitness, etc., and gives them advice about women. He tells them that there's no substitute for hard work and that if they want to have success with women, they have to approach a lot of them and ask them on dates. This is pretty typical Manosphere advice. Again, it's sort of, well, if you want to address the challenge, it's sort of like the American military. Build lots of aircraft carriers and lots of battleships and make sure you do studying after each time you do something in the real world so you can get better at it. And before you know it, you'll be conquering those Japanese and driving your boats all the way to Japan. To the extent that it works in helping men find more short-term success with women, see, Wren has a broader purview, and it often does, these guys are credentialed as prophets in the minds of their followers. Relationships with the opposite sex are primal, and someone who shows us success here is someone we are likely to trust on anything. And so right there you see the tension. Well, what works? Well, what works for what? Well, what works to have the woman I want? Okay, well, now you've got her. How's it working for her? Because if you don't keep her happy, she might not stay. It's women that walk out of relationship. It's women who initiate divorce. So, but does it keep working for you? Because, well, if your goal is to just have many, many women, well, that requires a particular approach. Of course, Christianity with a traditional Christian sexual orientation or position says, no, all you need is one. And, okay, I'll keep reading. This allows not just for just their factual accuracy information to spread, but also their bad moral frameworks that promote sexual promiscuity, etc. So now Wren wades in with a more traditional perspective. Some of these folks are like some of these folks, like Peterson, are relatively positive influences. Others are promoting very bad lifestyles. Xander seems to fall somewhere in the middle. If you've never sampled the Manosphere, this is a good short introduction to some of the thinking. It's also mostly accurate. If you are a man, you might actually find it educational. Keep in mind, however, that the domain these folks operate in is early stage relationships. In that sense, these videos are sort of the counterpart to the rom-com, the romance comedy, or romantic literature. It's all about sort of the initial phases and heightening and, this game of cat and mouse that men and women play together. Men and women are both engaging with each other, trying to figure out and get what they want. But of course, if they're simply informed by what they think they want now, well, they're not informed by their longer self and by their future self that might, in fact, want something different. And the difficulty is, of course, that if you're always just evaluating the world in terms of what I want now, you're probably not going to be set up for harder to reach and often better things later, which require self-denial. Keep in mind, however, that the domain these folks operate in is early stage relationships, from meeting women through dating. Xander is single and talks about dating, having dates for 10 years. And again, in sort of a traditional Christian place, dating for 10 years, who would do that? You want to find the right one, or at least find a good one, and then marry, and then you're off to other adventures, which is making your marriage work. And of course, making your marriage work is also embedded in a whole host of cultural, moral frameworks that are also changing in society, and that's part of what the church is really struggling to deal with. Hence, he and the bulk of similar folks have no concept of what it's like to be married for a significant period of time with kids. Interestingly, he is one of the rare Manosphere coaches who actively pitches himself to married men whose marriage is in trouble. In other words, well, maybe you did it wrong for your first 1, 2, 5, 10, 15 years, and maybe you finding yourself divorced or your marriage isn't well. Maybe you can use these to sort of understand women better and get your marriage in order. And now you're competing with, another entire self-help industry in terms of all of the books about making marriage work. And again, there's books for men and books for women and books that are for both. And there's Christian books and non-Christian books. Context matters. Regardless, if you want to get an understanding of why men turn to online gurus and are turning away from churches and other traditional authority figures and institutions, this watching video, I think watching this video will help. I've said from the beginning that one of my guiding principles is to live not by lies. Right from Dreer. I'm committed to trying to discern the truth as best I can and communicate it in a way that at least some people can accept, even if it's unpopular in many quarters. I don't always get it right, but that's my aspiration. I hope many others will adopt that mindset as well, because they can't just cede the playing field to Casey Zanders of the world. And so in the end, he sort of sets himself as sort of different from what Xander is encouraging. Now, if you really want to get deep into this, King's North is asking a lot of very deep questions. He begins by talking about the Zapatista group of rebels that are we are the product of 500 years of struggle, as he reads it. The background, more gunfire and palls of smoke indicate that a rebel column is storming the police headquarters. We are the inheritors of the true building of this nation, denied the most elemental preparation so that they can use as cannon fodder and pillage the wealth of our country. We don't care that we have nothing, absolutely nothing. There's no peace or justice for ourselves and our children. But today we say, ya basta. Enough is enough. 500 miles away, Mexico's President Carlos Salinas and his anointed heir Luis Donaldo Colosio were celebrating the New Year's in an exclusive holiday resort at the Pacific coast. The bell rang. Salinas and Colosio raised glasses of champagne and toasted the official arrival of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And they talk about that a little bit. It's been a long time since I wrote those paragraphs. That is the opening of my very first book, One No, Many Yeses, an account of the first wave of anti-globalization protests, which were published 19 years ago. Back then, excitable young anti-capitalist that I was, I believed that I was part of a worldwide mass movement which was rising up against the colonialists of the world's economies and cultures of an unaccountable corporate elite. Since at least the end of the Cold War, the declared aim of the Western powers has been the spread of global market economy, combined with liberal politics and culture, to every benighted corner of the earth. Since a globalized market can't function without globalized tastes, you can't sell your cheap burgers in Asia until you've convinced the Asians that they're loving it. And since liberalism also needs an appropriate soil to seed in, the momentum of this ideological crusade is towards the creation of one global culture, whether the world wants it or not. This threefold. Now, there's a lot of tension in here because, of course, Peterson will say, no, liberal ideas, capitalism is relieving people from desperate poverty all over the world at a pace of, 150,000 a day? I mean, a huge number like that. And so here you have King's North and Peterson very much on different ends of the spectrum. And even in, let's say, a popular revolution, which is the have-nots against the haves, the goal of the have-nots is to become haves. And that's part of what you see in revolutions is the continuing turning over of these things. Now King's North is very much wants to get in back to sort of a small is beautiful perspective. And what he's talking about is, okay, I'll just keep reading. Back in the late 90s, the anti-globalization movement that rose up in opposition to this process was a political melting pot of anarchism, localism, indigenous perspectives, radical environmentalism, liberal commitments to democracy, and various other strands, all of it uncoordinated and fervently anti-hierarchical. It was a mess, but it was also an exciting mess. And though a lot of people were involved, including me, were allergic to labels and boxes, there was no doubt that this was a movement of the left. Though wrong about plenty of things, the left had traditionally been correct about its negative impacts of global capitalism, while the right was floundered about denying its impacts on the poor, on democracy, and on nature, generalizing, valorizing greed and rapine, and then wondering where the traditional values they love had gone. You wouldn't have found any conservatives on the barricades at the anti-World Trade Organization protests. Most of them were either inside hymning the virtues of free trade or back in Washington and London ginning up our next Middle Eastern war. How times have changed. Here in the 2020s, the left anti-globalism that I once thought was the movement of the future is barely in evidence today. The most incisive opponent to corporate globalization today are often to be found on the right, or at least not from any identifiable sector on the left. Conservatism, traditionalism, and post-liberal critiques of the impact of globalization on local communities, nation-states, social cohesion, family formation, working-class prospects, culture, and even, though not often enough, the natural world are pouring out daily. The post-working class left, meanwhile, has veered into an identity politics cul-de-sac dictated largely by its commitment to an elite war and an obsessive pursuit of cultural inversion. The worldview that the academic Eric Kaufman calls left modernism is now the outlook of the professional managerial classes, the top 10% or so of society, and, not coincidentally, the beneficiary class of globalization via transnational corporations, the academic and cultural sectors, non-government organizations, global and regional bodies, and other collectives of usually unaccountable power. This class is rolling out the threefold ideology of globalism within their own nations and beyond. Meanwhile, a national populist movement built largely around working and middle class reactions to this ideology is coalescing around calls for national self-determination, some degree of cultural conservatism, economic protection, and democratic accountability. On the face of it, it is confusing. Why would transnational capital be parroting slogans drawn from leftist framework which claim to be anti-capitalist? Why would the middle class be further to the left than the workers? If the left was what it claims to be, a bottom-up movement for popular justice, this would not be the case. If capitalism was what it is assumed to be, a rapacious, non-ideological engine of profit maximization, then this would not be the case either. But what if both of them were something else? What if the ideology of the corporate world and the ideology of the progressive left had not forged an inexplicable marriage of convenience but had grown along from the same rootstock? What if the left and global capitalism are at base the same thing? Engines of destroying customary ways of living, replacing them with globalized, universalist, technological matrix that is currently rising up around us. We are living through a time of radical flattening. As this emerges, global systems, which I call the machine, rapidly replaces previous ways of being with a new and novel global civilization. Emerging from the Industrial Revolution and dislocations of modernity's revolutions, this machine is now engaged in a project of deconstructing both human nature and wild nature, replacing them with borderless world of etiolated, rational individuals, each of them equal participants in a global marketplace governed by algorithms, profit, and dreams of universal oneness. With the possible exception of the bit about the marketplace, this is also a good description of the project of the political left. The very notion of a left was born with modernity. The term comes from the seating arrangement of the anti-monarchy faction of the French Assembly after the Revolution. Despite much mythologizing, leftist ideology has always been primarily a product of urban intellectuals and middle-class radicals pursuing a project of theoretical leveling. This leveling always begins with the destruction of previous lifestyles. For Mao's Four Olds, a Bolshevik project to eliminate the bourgeois family, currently being resurrected by some of the contemporary left, French revolutionaries attempt to rationalize the landscape, the current progressive push to transition children, and what to end up doing is clearing ground for the machine. Progressive leftism and global capitalism, far from being antagonistic as some of us once thought, have turned out to be usefully snug fit. Both are totalizing utopian projects. Again, so now I would say that this vision of goodness from the machine that Kings North is pushing back again is very much part of part of the imminent frame, as Charles Taylor would call it. And of course, Kingsnorth wants, now into orthodoxy. There's an interesting blend of tensions here. Now, this video is quite deeply nested in Ken Wilber integral frameworks, which both David and Zubin are like.
Very much the heterodox space from 2018 onwards, because I think there was a really valid and necessary heterodox perspective that was. You're familiar with the Ken Wilber framework, so sort of pre-trans manifestation.
Yes.
And I think that's the best way of looking at. You had which is a sort of
Pre-rational,
pre-rational sort of an emotional reaction to whatever Hillary Clinton is selling. I don't want it.
Yeah.
Totally understandable, and but very emotional, very reactive. And within that, there were kind of reactionary forces. There was some kind of basket of deplorables involved in that as well. But that wasn't the only reason why people were rejecting Hillary Clinton.
Right.
So from 20...
Now, that would be very interesting, because David Fuller and Zubin Damania are going to be, I would imagine, far more... They're not manosphere figures at all in terms of how they would conceive of the good relationship between men and women, but they will be, in some ways, I would say, interested by Kingsnorth. And so this is, again, is where you have this weird moment where right and left is sort of, everyone is sort of unseated.
2016 onwards, you had like a rejection of a very naive liberal status quo that left out an awful lot of the world and had a moral superiority and was like, we're a hidden tribalism, sort of like, we're no longer tribal, we're open to everyone from all backgrounds, all sexualities, all races, unless you don't think like us.
Right.
And so rejected traditionalism, rejected anyone that had sort of a different moral palette around their kind of worldview, and people picked it up and they hated it for good reason, because it was very judgmental, it was very sanctimonious, it was all of these things.
It was self-contradictory too.
Self-contradictory.
Yeah, no
So
hierarchies except for the hierarchy that says there are no hierarchies.
Yeah. And so you had this rejection of the liberal status quo that manifested as a sort of pre-rational rejection. I think Trump and Brexit were very much kind of fueled to a large part by that. And then you had a more integrated, reflective rejection of that perspective that you saw with some of the more the intellectual dark web at its best.
At its best.
So these are the sort of podcasters, public intellectuals at their best. I think were articulating a rejection of this worldview that was more nuanced and more complete. But over time, because of the nature of the platforms we're using, a lot of them got pulled down into that more reactive space.
Yes.
And I think started becoming much more reactionary. You look at some of the kind of more high-profile members or people within that, and they're now kind of just shouting at people on Twitter and making fools of themselves in various different ways. They got pulled...
This image of shouting at people on Twitter.
pulled down into the kind of more emotional, more reactionary elements of that. And the irony is, again, coming back to the Ken Wilber model, I think if more of those people had that Ken Wilber model, which is the idea there is a way of understanding the world, an integrative second-tier perspective that understands that all of these different value structures have meaning, have a place, are related to each other in kind of in complex ways. We need traditionalism. We also need postmodernism, or a healthy postmodernism. That, I think, is ultimately what they lacked. A lot of these people lacked. There wasn't a real sense of an integration, so it became a reaction to the excesses of postmodernism, the excesses of what Wilber would call like green, multi-perspectival awareness, that then required, and if people are watching have no idea what I'm talking about, the book Trump and a Post-Truth World by Ken Wilber, written in 2017, I still think is probably the best guideline to kind of understanding the cultural landscape.
So understanding, if you have that framework, you can then see where you have the sort of pre-rational age, the sort of blue, like authority, etc. Then you have rationality, which was a lot of the 20th century, where we were, celebrating capitalism and merit and that kind of thing, and a kind of a more classic conservatism, like, hey, we're
Science and modernism.
Science, modernism, rationality, enlightenment. The Enlightenment era, that kind of thing. Then the postmodern era with, like you said, multiculturalism, so widening circles of compassion, widening acceptance, seeing that some views are constructed in a way that it doesn't make them as absolute. But then,
and the developmental model there is that as you were talking about, science, modernism, which is coded orange in integral theory, spiral dynamics, was it was uni-perspectival. It's like there is a truth, it is science, it is modernity, and then so there's a developmental pattern here of like how we evolve as well.
Right.
And then when postmodernism came in, the green worldview that came in much more strongly in the 60s, it was there are multiple perspectives. There are more than one perspective, and it's important that this one perspective tended to have biases. It was very male, it was very rationalist, it was very it put everything into its
maybe
frame.
Reductionist.
And then there are multiple perspectives, and they all need to. And it was a positive development originally,
Yes.
And then it went septic because ultimately it said, and there is no one truth. There is no truth.
Now that toxic, septic, that's sort of the flip side of this definition of the good. Did I lose my tab already? If good is the pleasure time doesn't disprove, septic is the eating away at any pleasure by, let's say, God number one, at a very low resolution type of perspective.
Truth, and yet that is a truth.
Yes.
That's the performative contradiction.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. But this is all absolutely necessary parts of human development and societal development. That's what a real Wilberian would say. Because
okay, so now we're getting into what is interesting, because you have sort of is it Hegelian? Is it a Christian progressivism? You basically have an arc of history that, well, all of these stages are, they lead to an eschaton. And in that way, it's sort of deeply Christian. It's not like ancient pagan, cyclical, or simply chaotic. There's an arriving at some place.
Because you can go, okay, well then is postmodern multiculturalism, is that the final say? Where people are upset now is, I think, when you talk about pre-trans, the pre-people are pre-green meme. They're still either living in orange or in blue, and they're throwing darts at something they see as ridiculous and alien.
And of course, when you talk this way, you sort of put yourself above it all and say, well, now I can see all of these people at their different levels, and they're all categorized nicely. And of course, if you're in those categories, it's like, hey, wait a minute, who made you the guru looking down from heaven on all of us?
And not to be had.
Yeah.
But the post-green people are standing in a what may be called integral or teal color. I've called it alt middle. It's just a new reframing of the same thing. It's looking at it and going, oh, all of this was necessary, but look at the downside of green, that you're seeing the shadow of green. We should criticize that shadow because you want to nudge to the next level, which is this integral level that says, oh, the first tier 2 level, where it's a slightly higher perspective, where it says, yeah, there are all these perspectives, but some are a little more complete. And including all of these as part and necessary, and actually honoring people that are in those levels and trying to nudge them to healthy levels of that level rather than dragging them into another level.
Again, healthy. I mean, there's toxic and there's healthy. But of course, it's got to be true over time.
Level, which never doesn't really work that well. If you look at immigration and things like that, taking somebody from a pre-rational level into modernity is always a shock. That's what I think you're pointing at with trans. So the IDW at its best was an integral look back at green going, hey guys, look, see, it's finally happening. Green is starting to show its age. Let's start to evolve into this new thing. But what we've seen is a regression back to a pre-state that's weaponized by audience capture and all this other stuff that we've talked about.
Yeah, because so much of the emotionality and the attractive force once you get particularly because you've got this paradox within the podcasters and public intellectuals that made up the IDW, of they were outside the institutions.
Yeah.
And if you look at kind of Eric Wein.
So institutions. Well, you need institutions. Institutions, sort of in a Jordan Peterson evolutionary truth sort of way. Institutions smaller than religions, which are these massive things. Institutions sort of preserve certain truths and allow you to scale those truths out and maintain them.
Einstein in particular talked about the only people who are able to tell the truth now don't have the institutional capture, don't have the fear of being kind of sacked or cancelled.
And so they become gurus online, whether it's talking about dating or talking about other truths out there, and
they are able to speak more openly. And that was what he was saying back in 2018. I think there's some truth to that. But what that didn't factor is the new failure conditions of the alternative. And I'd say that the morality tale of the last kind of 4 years for these public intellectuals and all of us who've been on social media, and I haven't been immune from it either. Like, I feel the weight of like the YouTube comments thread, and there are certain things that I'm sure I would have done differently had it not been for that. Like, we're all subject to these things, even subconsciously or unconsciously.
Absolutely.
But the morality...
Because here you have two guys who are basically sitting atop their little... they're not big empires, but they're little empires of their little YouTube kingdoms, and they themselves have created new institutions. Now, Tim Keller did a piece on the rise and fall of Mars Hill, which was quite good, and at some point maybe I'll swing around to that, probably in conjunction with this video, because there's some interesting parallels.
The reality tale of the last 4 or 5 years has been the failure conditions of the alternative, and audience capture, I think, is the main one, but by definition, these people are outside the institution, so they are much more dependent.
And so, if Manosphere online guru, well, what are his signs of success? Well, I suppose he has to have some success with women if he wants his credibility. He and the celebrity pastor, in that sense, are both captives to their systems. But also the ability for them to manage this new context that they are working within.
Dependent on their audience, dependent for income, for validation, for status. So in a way, it's kind of inevitable that you're going to end up being warped by that effect. And there's some fabulous. I think the one that I keep pointing people towards is the series on Dave Rubin called Dave Rubin's Battle of Ideas, which is an incredibly detailed, sophisticated account of Rubin's political trajectory from 2016 onwards, where he was genuine, I think, someone who was on the left and spotting some problems with the left, and how he became more and more kind of his political trajectory of being someone just interested in ideas to being more and more of a kind of right-wing I won't say demagogue, that's not quite true, but more
amplifier,
of a
writer.
Yeah, more captured by the right as time went on because of these audience dynamics.
But even Dave Rubin has other things he has to deal with. And while on one hand Dave Rubin sort of has this transformation into the political right to become this repeater, he's still sort of caught in this other conundrum, which I found this conversation fascinating.
It's sort of nauseating, I guess. But so we're on tour together, and David's texting me, and we're going back, and we're talking on the phone, and we're FaceTime, and it just keeps coming up, and you keep talking about this on stage. And on top of everything else, I'm meeting all of the people that are attending the shows. And you know this, the amount of people that were in new families, or that the wife was pregnant for the first time. And I'm seeing the joy on these people's faces. All of this is hitting me. And then you keep saying this thing that for most people, they have to do it. But there are these exceptions. And I kept thinking, well, wait a minute. Could I be the exception that I could live a fully actualized, best possible life?
Right there. And you find him saying that again and again. Fully actualized, best possible life. Well, there's that ideal. There's that ideal. Well, in the Manosphere, a fully actualized, best possible life is dating forever? is there an ideal out there that one must pursue?
Without having kids, and at the same time be married to someone who wants kids. Then what am I even married for?
Well,
what was
right. Well, that does beg that question, doesn't
right?
it?
So now
Because
these things are really hitting each other.
And what are you married for? Because obviously in the ancient world, your marriage would make no sense, because the purpose of marriage was to produce legitimate heirs. But now we're sort of going to have some kind of accommodation.
And because because the map wasn't there, the roadmap just wasn't there, I started going, man, I really have to think about this now. And I remember one night
Well, it's not that the roadmap isn't there; it's something else isn't there.
you were on stage, and I had the best seat in the house every night because I'm just off stage left, so I'm basically watching
stage
you.
right is actually better.
Stage right, I guess. Yeah, I suppose it depends which country we were in. But I'm basically watching you from behind, so I have sort of the back view of you to the crowd. So I genuinely felt that every night, that I was part of the show every night in that sense, part of the audience. And I remember you said it one more time, and I thought, all right, I have to do this. I have to do this. And that's why it was always incredibly honest when I would say to the crowd that being on tour with you, for every reason that they were there, that you helped these people change their lives, that you did that to me too. But now, and I think the purpose of this conversation, which, by the way, if you would have said to me 10 years ago that I'd be having this conversation publicly, first off, that I'd be married, I wouldn't have believed you. That I'd be having kids, I wouldn't have believed you. That I would be willing to talk about this, or even someone
And even I'd be having kids. How exactly are you having kids? We'll get into that in the video.
that someone else might look to help map it for them, I'd say you were completely insane. This is not really something, I'd rather talk about politics. I'd rather talk about the culture
this is
wars
important.
and all of these other things.
This is a political
But
issue too,
yes.
because we're trying to sketch out a pathway, I suppose. I mean, our culture appears to have decided that gay marriage is, well, I don't know if acceptable is the right word. It's become part of the structure of marriage itself. And so now the question is, okay, what does that mean? And that certainly opens up the question on the child front, because I mean, in some ways, marriage is the union of two people, but in a possibly more fundamental way, it's the union of two people to provide the foundation for children.
Right.
And I would say that's actually paramount. I mean, our society tends to flip that around, and we tend to think of marriage as something that, well, you find the partner right for you and you live happily ever after. It's, well, no, not exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe exactly, if you also understand that living happily ever after means living for other people in many ways, particularly your children. And then of course that complicates the issue on the gay marriage front, because as we're going to talk about, it's also more technically difficult to have children if you're a homosexual couple.
Right.
Technically difficult. There's a circumlocution.
So if you take just the marriage part first, meaning that,
And so I'm about out of time, so I want to swing back around. Aaron Renn sort of frames it in a moral sense, and that, well, here's Christian morality, so that is just the standard. But what you see in these other conversations is that there's a continual conversation going around about, okay, well, how much does this morality flex and bend, and how much of it is fixed? And you have a real difficulty there, because if it's always flexing and bending, then it isn't in that way morality. It doesn't serve. It can't act as a guide. It can't act as something that distinguishes and says, this is the proper mode of being. This is the proper way of behaving. This is how you act. These are the rituals that you pursue in order to achieve, and then you're back to achieving what? And the answer, I mean, we always keep bumping up into these issues, and the answer is, well, until you achieve everything. Well, what do you mean everything? Until you fill that hole. My eternity-shaped hole video didn't get that many views, but that's a very deep. God has placed eternity in our hearts. We have a drive to, and I would say it's a drive to God. and it's a drive to participate and realize, and but not just in some sort of disembodied emotional sense. Part of what was interesting and what I want to get at in the video with David Fuller and Zubin Zamania is they're going to talk about enlightening, and because that for them is sort of this conversion, but it's not just a matter of the lights coming on for me and knowing what to do. It's a matter of the lights coming on for an entire community, because in many ways we human beings can't do this alone. You have to do it together, and so you have to build structures in order to do it together, and this all has to go somewhere in order to achieve something. And then, of course, going back to Jesus, part of the reason Jesus sort of has it both ways in this is that there's a real sense in the Gospels that part of what the full realization of the Christian life awaits is the renovation of creation itself. It cannot be had until creation itself is redone. It cannot be had, in a sense, in this age of decay. And what Christians do is participate in the renovation of all creation, but that is something that is above and beyond us. And to get back into the King's North article, there's a sense in which some of that Christian eschatology is built into the machine, this vision of the machine, that here with these rituals and practices we can achieve it, and we can have both the hierarchy and the flattening equality, and you can have them both at once. But you say, well, reality can't contain that, so then you're back left to the Christian idea that reality itself needs to be transformed, but in the secular frame, only people can do this. It can't be done by God because you have deep questions about God number one and God number two. So I'm out of time. I hope this isn't just nonsense, but that's the thinking for today. Leave a comment. I hope in some ways you find something in it that's helpful.